the language around like male sexual purity was more about like, don't stumble, right? It was more about action, like don't do something wrong, don't stumble, which I think is actually better language in a way, because it implies a kind of like a misstep, but then something that can be corrected and you can, regain your footing again, right? But then the language that I would often hear in settings specifically around female sexuality, it would be very much about purity. And then once you lose it, it's gone forever.
Mm-hmm.
And you're now this kind of fallen woman, you're tainted forever. And that kind of implicit theology about sexuality, I think is damaging. And it certainly had a negative effect on me growing up in that kind of milieu.
You've all heard this story before. A brilliant person full of spiritual yearning lives a life of some degree of moral decadence, moves from one stage of philosophical investigation to the next, is ultimately won to Christ and the Church, and comes to serve as a witness to his or her own generation and beyond. St. Augustine comes to mind in the early Church, Thomas Merton in the 20th century. When an intellectual convert is asked why, or why now, or why this way, he or she may point to certain books, meaningful conversations, or powerful liturgical experiences. But the real explanation is more mysterious. It is grace, pure and simple. Abigail Favale knows about this grace, and she has a story to tell about it. Indeed, her unique tale may one day warrant her inclusion in the list of converts begun above. Raised evangelical, she turned to modern theories about people and society, feminism and its various ideological attachments, as a way to understand herself and her purpose before God. She came to define herself as a chaplain to the doubters. But in her heart, the real God, who knows no theories or ideologies, was hard at work. Favale eventually came into full communion with the Catholic Church. But then, the real work of understanding her faith began in earnest. In 2018, Favale published a magnificent account of her faith journey in a book called Into the Deep, An Unlikely Catholic Conversion. Republished now by Ignatius Press, Favale's work cuts to the heart, and a wider audience will now be grateful to be exposed to her powerful testimony. Abigail Favale is a writer and professor in the McGrath Institute for Church Life at the University of Notre Dame. She is well known for engaging topics related to women and gender from a Catholic perspective, taking better account of non-Catholic arguments than their proponents do. Favale is the author of the groundbreaking book, The Genesis of Gender, A Christian Theory, also published by Ignatius Press, along with numerous essays and short stories in publications including First Things, Public Discourse, and The Atlantic. In 2017, she was awarded the J.F. Powers Prize for Short Fiction. Abigail Favale's conversion story is totally captivating, and it is my great pleasure to welcome her to discuss it with me now on the Ignatius Press podcast. Abigail Favale, welcome to the Ignatius Press podcast. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing very well. Today, we're going to discuss your spiritual memoir, which is called Into the Deep, An Unlikely Catholic Conversation. Now, it was originally published back in 2018, but Ignatius Press is republishing it now, and I'm glad that they are because I really, really enjoyed the book, and I know that our listeners are going to want to go out and get this handsome new edition of it, which I'm holding up for our viewing audience. Let's start, Abigail, with one of the words in your title, unlikely. I want to get into the deep part in just a minute, but maybe you could first tell us why your coming into the Catholic Church was so unlikely.
That's a great question, actually. I don't know if I've ever been asked that question. I mean, in some way, maybe most people in our time are like every convert, it might be an unlikely convert. But I guess there would be several reasons I would point to. One would be I was coming from a worldview. So I was raised evangelical Protestant, but when I became Catholic, I had spent about a decade in a kind of more post-Christian, postmodern, feminist worldview. So very far away from Christianity, even though I still was academically interested in Christian theology. I didn't pray, I didn't go to church, I didn't practice Christianity at all. I was pretty agnostic, depending on the day. And I had very deeply held feminist beliefs that are very much at odds with Catholicism. So the idea of an all-male priesthood or Catholic teaching on contraception and abortion and same-sex marriage, those were all very much at odds with my worldview. So that's one reason, is that like there was a pretty big chasm between many of the things I believed and what the Catholic Church teaches. And also, sometimes people ask me like, so did you have a lot of, did you know a lot of Catholic people before you became Catholic? Like, I didn't know, no one in my family was Catholic. I knew one Catholic who was, and I think actually it was helpful to know this one particular Catholic who was maybe more of a dissenting Catholic, right? But so I only knew one Catholic. And I had never gone to Mass, but I started RCIA, and I only went to Mass for the first time after going to RCIA, aside from maybe some like tourist times that I had wandered into a church or something. So all of those factors, I think, you would look at someone like that and say, that person is very unlikely to convert to Catholicism.
And yet, when you read your book, and when all of us who have come into communion with the Catholic Church from outside tell our story, there's a certain logic to it all. It does all point in the right direction, and that definitely comes through in your book. But in various ways, as you've already begun to explain, it's clear when someone reads your book that there are just all these different ways in which the Catholic Church might not have seemed like the most likely place for you to end up. And on that note, maybe we can go back and talk for a minute about your evangelical upbringing, which resonated with me as somebody who also grew up evangelical. I know that there are probably a lot of listeners out there who will resonate with certain parts of your story. I want to focus on one part in particular, which is, you talk a lot about, growing up in evangelical churches, and, in that context, you're just steeped in the Bible, right? And you're always drawn from your earliest memories to the women of the Bible. And then as you sort of grow up and sort of think about those stories, you sort of come to understand the evangelical churches, the way that they think not only of women, but of like women's sexuality as like this very particular, it sort of fits into this very particular kind of thing. So I don't know, I wonder if you could just kind of reflect with what I put on the table there from your story about some of that.
Yeah, I mean, so from a young age, I, like a good evangelical child, I think when I was 10, I was given a Bible for Christmas, that was my own with my name on the cover. And I started reading it, and they had these little study tracks in the beginning of the Bible, and there was one on women in the Bible. And that I just read that one over and over and over. So it kind of selects different stories. And I read the stories over and over, and I loved them, especially stories of women in the Old Testament. There are just some really interesting female figures in the Old Testament, good and bad, which but then I couldn't help but notice that many of the stories that are in the Bible that I'm very much kind of connecting with or enjoying were never really talked about when it came to actual church services or sermons. I didn't hear many sermons on, say, like women should stay at home. It was more like women just weren't talked about. Like that, you just don't talk about women. You don't. I never heard a sermon about a woman, right? Even though it's one of the things I love about being Catholic is that you have the lectionary, you have the readings that come up, and so these stories are like woven into salvation history, and they cycle through. Like you can't avoid them as Catholics, which is wonderful. So there was kind of already this, I don't know, like discordance between what I was seeing in the Bible. Like there's more to the story here, which is kind of ironic, right? Because it was a very like bibliocentric sect of Christianity. It was a Bible church that I was attending, right? But there were just portions of the Bible that weren't really addressed at all, and most of them containing women. So I think that kind of disconnect, it sparked a desire for me to learn more, and by the time I went to college, I was very much asking questions about what does it mean to be a woman as a Christian? What does God think about women? What is my calling as a woman? I was very much wrestling with those questions and carried them into college.
Yeah, and there's where, to pick up another word from your title, there where deep comes in, because it just is so clear in your story right from the beginning that you're just not content with just what's on the surface, right? And so that's just a wonderful thing. And just to pick up the other point that I was getting at about kind of the sexuality thing, you paint a picture of yourself as a girl growing up in this evangelical world where there's a kind of like all or nothing view, it seems like, of things like sexual purity. And and I can only imagine, and just knowing a little bit about it myself, but not being a woman, but reading your story, just sort of how difficult that must be to kind of navigate that world, especially being somebody who's seeking after truth from a young age like you were.
Yeah, that was a big, I mean, it's interesting to kind of look at my spiritual journey as a whole and to see how these questions about women, about sexuality, I mean, they're very much prominent strands in my own story. And, I'm still interested in these questions as a Catholic. But yeah, growing up evangelical, it was very much the time. I don't know if it's still the same or not. I don't have as close a read on that world, but it was the 90s, right? And very much the era of I Kiss Dating Goodbye, the era of purity rings, the era of true love waits. And so on the one hand, like, okay, there's nothing bad about the kind of goal or the ideal, the expectation to save sex for marriage, right? But then the way that was packaged in a kind of theology about sexuality, or a lack of theology about sexuality, actually, I would say, it was presented as this kind of rule, right? But there's no reason behind it. It was like, okay, you just follow this one rule. And there was this aura around sex that was like, ooh, sex is scary. It's bad. It's shameful. Don't do it, avoid it. But then when you're married, it'll be amazing, right? And there also seemed to be a kind of double standard in that there was much more kind of hand-wringing and anxiety about women's sexual purity, or at least it was talked about in different ways. So like boys, I think, were the language around like male sexual purity was more about like, don't stumble, right? It was more about action, like don't do something wrong, don't stumble, which I think is actually better language in a way, because it implies a kind of like a misstep, but then something that can be corrected and you can, regain your footing again, right? But then the language that I would often hear in settings specifically around female sexuality, it would be very much about purity. And then once you lose it, it's gone forever. And you're now this kind of fallen woman, you're tainted forever. And that kind of implicit theology about sexuality, I think is damaging. And it certainly had a negative effect on me growing up in that kind of milieu.
Yeah. And so then, processing all of that and coming into your, coming out of adolescence and going away to college, still obviously fascinated by Christianity and interested in all these questions. I was really struck that you described kind of your journey where you discover Christian feminism, where you learn kind of about, different kind of like biblical hermeneutics, where you can kind of understand things differently than how you had been taught in the evangelical world. And then I loved this line, and I wonder if you could just reflect on this. You said, "I was the feminist prophet come to rescue my religion from itself."
Mhm.
I love that line because I think that there's, I don't know, I think that there are a lot of people who could resonate with that, like, who are on a journey, to kind of discover the truth, and it takes certain forms, but especially, really smart people who ultimately also have really big hearts for God, I think sometimes end up with that perspective. So I
Mhm.
just love to hear more from you about that.
Sure. Yeah. So I discovered feminism in college and really just kind of went whole hog into it. And I think initially I was a pretty good evangelical feminist, I would say, where my focus was on, okay, we just need to know what the Greek terms mean. And if we interpret these tricky Paul passages correctly, it will affirm the idea that men and women have equal dignity and kind of an egalitarian ethos. But I still took the Bible seriously. I still had a sense that there was a divine authority to which I was beholden. But at some point in my kind of immersion in feminism in college, that shifted. And then it became the shift that kind of is captured in that line is that eventually I became the figure of authority who was in a position to kind of put Christianity and the Bible in the judgment seat and to kind of judge from outside, like what's true, what's bad, what should be kept, what should be discarded. And so at that point, by the time I had that kind of mentality, I had really stepped away from any kind of belief in a divine revelation or a divine authority that had been revealed that should in fact judge me, not the other way around. Um, so yeah, I think that was the shift that kind of happened in my undergrad years.
Yeah, and you also talk about kind of, okay, well, maybe we can think of God as mother or something, and then maybe we can say some prayers to God as mother. But you actually say that the more kind of you started thinking that way, the less you wanted to pray at all.
Yeah. Yeah. So that was in that phase. I mean, I do want to say, like, to caveat this, like, there are instances in the Bible where feminine metaphors are used to describe God, right? Like as a hen gathering her chicks under her wings, that sort of thing. So I'm not saying that's bad or whatever. There's scriptural precedent for that. Um, but the step that I took, I think, was to discard the primary metaphor that we have for God, which is the fatherhood of God. And so I remember I was going to this kind of Anglican house church at the time, and we were getting more feminist. And so I don't know whether I volunteered for this or they asked me to do this, but I was somehow kind of commissioned to rewrite the Our Father as the Our Mother. Which is, there's so many levels there, which I think are interesting now. One, just the shift in metaphor and the kind of abandoning of the traditional metaphor and not even being aware of what was being lost in that or what the purpose of that metaphor was or how that shift in metaphor might have downstream consequences theologically and even devotionally, but also just the assumption that that's something that you can do, right? That you can just kind of like, okay, I'm going to now like completely rewrite the prayer that Jesus gave us to use in my own words, like, and not just as like a poetic exercise, but actually as something that we would use liturgically, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this gets back to that point I was making earlier in that kind of shift in the authority, like who has the authority here, really? And without even kind of realizing it, it's not like I consciously decided like I now am the authority. I had kind of adopted that posture in relation to the faith. And I think that's why when I started to pray the Our Mother, I lost the desire to pray at all because it's not just about the prayer, but it's the fact that rewriting and then praying that prayer was a signal that I was no longer in a right relationship with God. I was no longer in a relationship of like creature to creator. Instead, I was kind of the creator,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I think once you're kind of out of that right relationship, then that puts you out of sync. And then what is the point of praying, right? if I'm in a sense my own God, or
Right.
I'm kind, who am I praying to? Like, what does prayer even mean? Like, what is and so I think those were all that there was all this like erosion happening, which I didn't even consciously kind of realize, right? It was just these kind of little steps forward, a step forward, a step forward. And before I knew it, I really had lost my faith altogether.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and maybe this is a good place to pick up this, I guess we could say, like, catastrophic, I guess to use a Tolkien term, like a catastrophic event in your life, which was becoming a mother yourself, which you talk about how, I think you say, it broke me open, you say, which I think that's an interesting connection to kind of exploring the spirituality, which is moving you towards, well, what if I can think of God as mother, and then kind of feeling like that doesn't quite satisfy, and then becoming a mother yourself and finding yourself kind of reset in your relationship with God.
Yeah, I like that you made that connection, because I mean, I think what I was doing and kind of praying to God as mother, I would have thought, well, I'm investing value in motherhood. Like I'm, but in a way, because I was just kind of putting things in the wrong places, in a way it was kind of denigrating motherhood and fatherhood, or at least misunderstanding the deeper meanings of those things. And it was all conceptual, right? Like I was not a mother at that time, and I didn't become a mother for another like 7 or 8 years after that point. And when I did become a mother, it completely shifted everything. Or it certainly, I mean, at that point, that was at the end of a phase of going to graduate school, being immersed in feminist theory, and ceasing to practice the faith really altogether. And then becoming a mother, there were a lot of things that shifted, but one of them was I began to ask questions that I just had ceased asking. Some of the kind of feminist cliches that I had adopted no longer seemed to make sense, like the idea that, gender is mostly a social construct, right? Like the kind of confrontation of the realities of my own and the power of my own femaleness. Becoming a mother to a son kind of opened my world as well. I wasn't so narrowly focused just on like women and women's experiences. So that shifted, like there was kind of an intellectual shift that was happening. But I also think that motherhood just, and because of the suffering as well, like I think the kind of suffering that is part of motherhood, the very physical suffering of it, as well as then the kind of more like emotional suffering that comes along once you actually have the child, I think that can be so fruitful, because because it's so hard. Like I think it brought me back to reality in a way, in a painful kind of confrontation with reality. But yeah, it really kind of sent me spinning into a sort of existential crisis, because all the things I had kind of just taken for granted about what it means to be a woman, what is real, started to become a little unstable.
And this crisis leads you to somewhat inexplicably become Catholic. And one of the things that I loved about your testimony, if I can call it that, and in some ways this resonated with my own, was your confession that it actually was after you became Catholic that you sort of spent time really working through what you believed, like your kind of acceptance of what had been revealed, to the church which you had come into. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think this is another reason why my conversion is unlikely, in the sense that a lot of the Protestant converts I know think very deeply and wrestle very deeply with their objections. And I did not do that prior to becoming Catholic.
Mm-hmm.
I just kind of was swept in, really. And it's hard to even just, explain how that occurred. Although I attempt to do so in the book with a particular episode that I won't tell here, so that people will actually buy the book to read it. But there's a particular moment where I get kind of hit by grace and pushed inexplicably into the Catholic Church. But so I I started the process of joining the church and joined the church very quickly. And God was very gentle with me and generous with me at this time and just sending me all sorts of consolations. So even though I still had these intellectual doubts, I was willing to suspend my disbelief because of the spiritual richness that I was encountering. But then after I entered the church, he started to wean me a little bit, which is, you need to do. And then I was like, what have I done? What have I signed up for? I mean, I became Catholic thinking that I would, become a Catholic, like, for example, the Catholic I knew who was very devout in certain ways, but also just, I disagree with the church on contraception, on women, on women priests and abortion. I just thought, oh, okay, that's just what Catholics do. So I'll do that too. But once the sacramental life began working in me, once the grace of the sacraments began working in me, I just was no longer really satisfied with that. And so I got to a place where I was like, okay, I want to at least understand why the church teaches what she does on these things that I don't agree with, which were the kind of feminist objections. I didn't expect that I would be convinced of them. I just at least wanted to understand. And so it was at that point that I began to very seriously study Catholic theology of sexuality, because that's really where all these issues kind of cluster on the question of like, does sexual difference matter? What is the meaning of sexual difference? What is the meaning of the fact that we are male and female? All of my objections or all of my questions were kind of clustered around that. And I also began to pray. And this I think is even more important than the decision to study those questions. But I actually began to pray that God would form me, right? Which is that's like the opposite posture than what we were talking about earlier, where it's like, no, I know what's right. I know what's good. I'm in the driver's seat. I'm going to rewrite these prayers. It was like, no, I want you to tell me what's true. Right. And there's this prayer from Cardinal Newman that was very powerful for me at this time. It's a very powerful prayer, I think, where in the prayer you sacrifice your cherished wishes, your cherished opinions, and then you ask God, make me what thou wouldst make me. And he did. It was a very intense, very disorienting, beautiful, but also painful time, right? Because once I really became Catholic, I think in total, I guess I began to think like a Catholic and really accept what the church teaches as a whole. That was profoundly disruptive to my marriage. My husband wasn't Catholic. And I was the one who changed, right? He's just like, I'm just the same guy I've always been, right? And now you're, you're over here saying like, oh, we can't use contraception anymore. And so it was disruptive to my marriage. It was profoundly disruptive to my career. I lost a lot of relationships because of it, So it was very, very hard, but also the best thing that's ever happened to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that comes across in the way you describe your journey. I'm reminded there's a passage in the book where you talk about a student of yours who became Catholic, and you were kind of initially excited for him, and then you kind of were a little troubled because you found out he really believed the things that that the church taught. But it struck me as I'm reading your testimony that you must have experienced some of that same thing. I mean, I know I did. We live in such a kind of you do you culture, right? That even if you do something like become Catholic, your friends will probably say like, hey, great. If that works for you, then great, exactly. Right? But then it's when you like really surrender yourself, like you describe, to wanting what God wants, that then things can get a little tricky.
Right. And then people are like, whoa, like, yeah. Oh, you went all the way with that one. Okay. Yeah. And that was sort of the reactions I would get, it wasn't ever anything like dramatic. Like, I reject you now as a person. It was more like, oh, like you're pro-life now? Like, yeah. Oh, and then just kind of like quiet ghosting. Right. It was more like that. Like I had cooties, a little bit now, like, oh, this is kind of strange. Cause I had very much adopted a like being progressive, especially on issues of sexuality and gender, was very much a part of my identity, not just personally, but professionally. And so it was when my mind began to change on those issues and I could no longer affirm the things that I had publicly affirmed and stood for. That's when, people began to sort of just like exit stage left, yeah.
Yeah. And it seems to me those are the people who I hope would read, especially the second half of your book, because something that readers will recognize when they pick it up is that it's structured in a really, really wonderful way. I think the first half, most people could just read it and say, well, this is a woman telling her story. And, this is great. Look at, she arrived where she felt like she was supposed to be. Great. But then the second half, you're really unpacking. You're really kind of like, it's still personal and it's still you telling your story, but it's like really digging into that. It's that deep part.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's marked by, it's marked by things that I think will really jump out at people. And I want to bring up one of them. You talk about veiling. And that becomes kind of a, wearing a veil in mass. And that becomes kind of a symbol for a larger exploration that you're having. You've touched on some of that already, but I wonder if you could just say a little bit more and maybe specifically about that issue.
Yeah. So what prompted that kind of devotional practice for me at that time was, it's like kind of ironic, but it was actually watching a film about Orthodox Jews. But it was a beautiful film. And one of the things that I noticed about it was just how every aspect of their life was like pointed at God, everything, like, and what they wore pointed at God. And I just remember thinking like, I wish I had that, because at the time I was kind of a new Catholic, but I was like going to mass on Sundays, but it still felt like kind of like something I do once a week, right? It wasn't the fabric of my life and of my existence. I was like aware that some women have this kind of devotional practice. I had seen it. And kind of on impulse, when I started to pray that prayer I mentioned earlier, when I would, in private prayer, I just started covering my head when I would pray. And it was a way of entering into prayer with my entire body. Basically, it was like, this is not just an intellectual exercise. This is like all of my being is yours, like kind of veiling, like putting God over me in a way. I think that kind of embodied practice was really important for me at the time. And then the first time, which this is something I love about the story, is that the first time I decided to try to do it during Mass, it was a daily Mass, and I was on maternity leave. It was just a weekday. I didn't even know what day it was. And I just went, and I was wearing a scarf, and I just kind of like, popped the scarf up. And then as soon as the reading started, I realized like, oh my gosh, this is the Feast of the Annunciation. And I had no idea going into it, right? Like, I'm just still a new Catholic out in all the feast days. And the Annunciation is like I have a very strong devotion to the Annunciation. So that was also one of these kind of wonderful, synchronicities that God kind of weaves together, right? That as I'm kind of in my spiritual life, gradually entering into this kind of Marian posture, to have like that. That's really what the veil was for me. It was like a tangible sign of entering into a kind of Marian posture in relation to God. And so the first time that I felt the impulse to do that was on the Feast of the Annunciation, even though I didn't know that. I think is very cool.
That is very cool. Let's talk about Mary then while we're on the subject, because I remember, when I became Catholic, people said, oh, I bet you had to really wrestle with kind of Mary stuff for a while before you became Catholic. And I was like, not really. But I'll tell you what, I'm still, as a Catholic, am really praying that I find deeper devotion to Mary, because I'm not sure I'm there yet with that. And it seems like your story kind of follows that trajectory a little bit. Like your after being Catholic is when you sort of develop a deeper devotion to Mary.
Yes, that's certainly true. I did not have an aversion to Mary, because I think one of the things that in fact drew me to Catholicism was just the presence of the feminine. You walk into a Catholic space and there's female iconography all over the place, right? And that was something that's entirely not a part of the way that I was raised in Christianity. Again, it was almost like the feminine aspects of the faith just were like not present. And so I was drawn to that. So I was drawn to Mary, even though I didn't know why, and then I think I had a kind of feminist understanding of Mary, which is like, this is cool that it's a woman, but also she's kind of a symbol that's an impossible ideal for women to fulfill, blah, 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 kind of the feminist suspicious sort of attitude toward Mary. But I was drawn to her, I think, from the beginning. And there, that time, that first year or so of becoming Catholic, like there are these kind of profound moments or profound like sorry, my phone's ringing. Encounters with Mary throughout my kind of spiritual journey. But then after I became Catholic, there would be these moments that would happen on the feast days, right? Which I, as a new Catholic, like I didn't know any of that, right? And one of, some of them are like, the kind of stories that are like, you tell people and they're like, what? That didn't happen, But I think very quickly, Mary came for me when I became Catholic, and kind of took me by the hand and began to guide me into a particular kind of path of a Marian path, a spiritual path. In order I almost needed like the opposite. So a lot of Protestants are like, they kind of need Jesus to introduce them to Mary. I almost needed Mary to introduce me to Jesus, to like reintroduce me to the masculine aspects of the faith that I had become so averse to. And so, yeah, that's been one of the most wonderful parts of being Catholic, I think, is developing that devotion to Mary and just feeling led by her deeper into love of Christ.
Yeah, that's wonderfully put. Let's talk about, you have a chapter called Absolution. And this is another thing for me as a convert. Sometimes people will say, well, was it really like understanding the Eucharist that was a big obstacle? And I say, actually, as a former Protestant, I mean, the idea that you have to go to confession is really a much bigger deal than coming to understand that Christ is really present in the Eucharist. That was just me, but that came across a little bit in your book as well. And actually, that experience of having, of course, made a confession in order to come into the Catholic Church, but then really exploring after that, so much more that you really felt like would provide healing and grace and everything. In some respects, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like, very much at odds with the idea that like you can kind of psychologize things and theorize things and all the kinds of things that maybe, maybe you had explored in your academic studies. So I wonder if you could tell us a little more about that.
Yeah, that chapter is a little wild. And I will save the best story. I'm not going to tell the best stories. But there's. So when I became Catholic, that first confession, so I wasn't very well, I'll be honest, I was not very well formed in the kind of onboarding process, shall we say. And so my first confession, no one really talked to me about what to expect. They're just like, oh, it'll be fine. Father will guide you through it. So I went in, didn't really do any prep ahead of time, didn't really think about it. I went in kind of like, I think the first thing I asked was like, so do I need to like confess like everything? Like how far back do I need to go here? And he was like, well, just whatever's weighing on you now. And I was like, oh, okay. Which was like very little, right? Because I had not been well formed. So I just confessed like stuff that was kind of live, for me now. I did not turn the page backward into the recesses of my past. Now, of course, like I hadn't intentionally hidden anything, right? So I believe like I received absolution at that point. So it wasn't that I think that the sacrament wasn't effective or something like that. And I certainly wasn't intentionally hiding anything. But later, after I had kind of entered more into this process of prayer and being formed, I felt very much moved to do a general confession, which is like everything, right? And there was a lot of kind of spiritual warfare happening around that. Like I was being prepared, I think, for that general confession to really, kind of exercise my past in a way from many of the kind of sins and wounds that I still had not faced, even though I, gone to that first confession. And so that experience, I think, of that general confession was one of the most powerful experiences of my life. And I'm incredibly grateful for it. Right. But I definitely there was like a spiritual preparation for it. And because of the circumstances that were happening to me at the time, which again, you have to read the book to find out, I very much went into that general confession almost like I'm going into battle, and I'm ready, like I wasn't, it was like a very like powerful experience because I was willing to just bear it all. And I did. And yeah.
Yeah. And there's that word deep again, just this, this consistent theme throughout the book of kind of always going deeper. I was reminded as you were talking, you mentioned John Henry Newman before. And I from time to time just stop and reflect on the fact that he took 2 days to make his confession before he, before he was received. And I mean, that's not what I did. And so I'm, reading your book definitely is convicting in the sense that I'm sure that there's a lot more that I and anyone who reads your book can it's good work to do. It's good soul work to, kind of think about and pray about the things that we need to bring into the confessional and receive that grace and that healing to be forgiven. So that's very helpful. Maybe we can kind of wind down talking about family matters. I know it's probably a sensitive topic, but you write about it in the book, and it was very moving to me. And I know it will deeply touch people who read the book. How you talk about your relationship with your husband and the way that you, you at least at the time of the publication of the book, have been kind of navigating your faith alongside your husband, who's not Catholic. I guess I have a number of questions about that, but I'd love to just hear your reflections on kind of, what all that means to you and where are you with that?
Yeah. That's the last chapter of the book for a reason, in a way, because it was the hardest to write in some ways. This genre is hard because it's one thing to kind of bare your own soul and air your own dirty laundry, but to kind of talk about other people is hard, but you can't avoid it, especially when you're married, right? And in my case, I became Catholic, and my husband was not Catholic at all at the time. He is now, I will say. Yes. So he eventually entered the church about, I think, 3 years after the kind of events described in the book end. And his also a very unlikely conversion and so different from mine. Like it's so fascinating to see how God works with each individual soul to draw them in. But yeah, this last chapter in the book talks a lot about the kind of the pain of not being completely unified in this way, to be kind of swept up into really this kind of love story with God, but then also to feel, as a result of that, a widening gulf between my husband and I, right? Because it was almost like the further in I went into faith, the further I felt I was moving away from him, right? But at the same time, I learned so much from that experience, especially how the most important thing we can do, I think, in praying for and hoping for the conversions of our loved ones is to actually get out of God's way and to not try to like force a conversion at our own timing, but rather to pray behind the scenes and to be so patient and almost to be kind of quiet, right? So I write in this book about, I guess, to be restrained rather than like, hey, read this book, let's talk about this, but to rather almost like fade into the woodwork a little bit to make way for God to work. But I talk about this woman named Elizabeth LeSueur, who I believe is a saint, but is not officially a saint, but who had a marriage like this. And she has a spiritual diary that I still use. I still read devotionally because there's so much wisdom there, I think. and even though my husband's Catholic now, not everyone in my family or not everyone I love is Catholic. So I think her approach that I write about in that chapter that I learned about how to kind of pray and hope for the conversion of loved ones is, I still think, the best kind of advice that I would give to someone in the situation that I was in.
Yeah, and we won't give away the stories, but I mean, the what you relate, I mean, it's just very, very moving and raw. And I mean, the conversations that you relate between you and your husband, I know that people will really benefit from seeing that in your book. I just wanted to, though, flag one line. There was at one point in your narrative there in that last chapter, you talk about a priest who told you this: if you want your husband to become Catholic, don't focus on his conversion, focus on your own. And I think that sort of encapsulates what you were saying before about sort of getting out of God's way. But what a wonderful sort of line for probably a whole lot of people who are in a lot of pain about wondering about their loved ones, for them to take heart from something like that.
Yeah, I mean, the fact is now that what I prayed for and what I entrusted to Mary, that was another thing. I entrusted that intention to Mary, and I prayed for it every day for years, and trusting it over and over again to Mary. And now on kind of the other side of that, right? Like, my husband has become Catholic, which is so beautiful. But at the same time, I can see, like, in retrospect, how the fact that it took a long time and was really hard, God was also using that in my own deepening conversion, right? Like, the kind of residual suffering of that was part of the suffering of my own conversion, right? So sometimes I think our impatience, understandably, our impatience to kind of want someone to, this loved one to, like, become Catholic now, that's actually, in a way, wanting to, like, remove a cross that God has given to us for our own conversion, that we don't want to carry, that we're like, okay, God, now's the time. This cross is getting heavy. I don't like being alone like this. I don't like feeling so spiritually isolated. But it was also a way of God teaching me to rely on him, to trust on him, to, give my husband to him, and to not kind of hoard him. Yeah.
Yeah, I think your emphasis on patience is important. I remember I was thunderstruck once when somebody said to me, Andrew, everybody says life is short, but actually life is long. Life is long. So, I mean, it's short in one way, but it's long in another way. I mean, just kind of keep at it. Don't worry, and strangely, that's kind of comforting. You in the book, maybe it's sort of about your husband, your past, kind of a bit of everything. But I loved this sentence, and I wanted to, or two sentences, I just want to read them and get your reflection. You said, "I had been preoccupied with the wrong question entirely, homing in on a speck and missing the fresco. The particular note I am singing doesn't matter. What matters is the song itself." I wonder, I mean, can we extrapolate from that sort of your whole journey? I mean, I just think that's sort of a beautiful way to kind of sum up what you write.
Yeah. Yeah, it really is true. And I think in that, that sentence I'm talking about, in that chapter on marriage, I also talk about some of the places in scripture about, wives submitting to husbands, and some of that language in scripture, which had been such an alienating thing for me for so long, and beginning then to understand what that meant now that I had the whole view in mind, right? Like, now that I saw the whole, and I saw first of all, what that actually means, like what we're actually called to, in the Christian understanding of marriage. It's not the kind of, like, one-sided submission that I had been raised to understand it as. But also to see, I think one of the big primary shifts that happened was to see surrender as a positive thing when it's surrendering to the right thing, which is God, right? No human being deserves our kind of whole person surrender in that way. Not even a spouse, I would say, like that kind of whole surrender to God. And I had just seen that kind of language is so negative, which had actually kind of spiritually crippled myself, right? So learning the lesson that like surrendering to love and trusting in love is actually a beautiful thing and not something to fear. And then that did kind of create a shift in my marriage as well, right? Because there is this mirroring between marriage, between the love of a husband and wife and the love of God and humankind and God and the individual soul, right? Those things are very much connected. And so I had to learn that that kind of submission is actually a good thing.
Yeah, and that wholeness is so important. I mean, just becoming Catholic not because it's the biggest and best denomination, but because it is the totalizing vision of reality and something that we can sort of be drawn deeper and deeper into. Abigail Favale, thank you so much for joining me today. The book is Into the Deep: An Unlikely Catholic Conversion, available now from Ignatius Press. Thanks again.
Thank you so much.